Richard Florida is a leading urbanist. He's a professor and also an author. And he says America's biggest divide is not red versus blue, but rather city versus suburbia, arguing that where we call home is one of the most crucial factors affecting where we sit in the social ecosystem. He joined our Walter Isaacson to map out the state of urban hubs today, from income inequality to big tech.
You're a great urban studies scholar, and you helped invent the notion of the creative class and how that was going to revitalize American cities. Explain what that original notion was.
So here's where it comes from. I was born in Newark in the late 1950s. I watched Newark decline and decay. I saw the city jobs and industry move to the suburbs. I actually witnessed the National Guards and tanks in the street. When I was a young scholar, no one believed that cities could come back. So flash forward. Now it's the late 1980s and 1990s. I'm living in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh was hit hard by deindustrialization. What could begin to revive cities? What I began to see was in places like New York, in San Francisco at the time, in Boston, there was this group of people, scientists, technologists, startup people, artists, musicians, professor types, who were coming back to cities, and I couldn't explain it. That's where the idea of the creative class comes from. And when we put the numbers to it about the year 2000, what we found is this group of people, which was less than 10% of the workforce when I was a boy, grew to a third of the workforce. And in big cities, these scientists, techies, business managers, knowledge workers, and artists were now 33, 40, 45% of the workforce. So that is the creative class, and it is the force, like it or not, for good and bad, that has revitalized many of our cities.
And because they moved into the urban core more than they would go to the suburbs.
Yeah, and I think what happened really is that, you know, I wrote this book in 2002, so it's quite a ways time ago. After about 2000, this urban revival just goes on steroids. And these folks begin to cluster in cities, not just because they like cities, not because they just have great parks and amenities and universities and coffee shops. What the economists have found is the cities, they're clustering in cities is what drives economic growth, creates innovation and productivity, but they don't cluster in all cities. Now, they have gone into many cities, but they tend to cluster in these superstar cities, like New York or Los Angeles or London in the UK, or these big tech hubs like San Francisco or Seattle or Boston or maybe Washington, D.C.
You got some pushback from people like Joel Kotkin, who said, okay, it's a great theory, but the numbers don't show it. The data's not there. People actually are moving to suburbs, not cities. What was your answer there?
And it's funny because Joel has become, believe it or not, a great personal friend, and we have had some of the most vicious fights. But I told him, I literally said, Joel, I've learned about as much from you as I've learned from anyone else. Look, the creative class can thrive in suburbs. And we did the data later. We started with metros, right? These suburban, urban agglomerations. When you look at the data, there are some suburbs, you know, even in the outskirts of Detroit, suburbs like Royal Oak and Birmingham that have very high clusters of the creative class. I don't think it's an either or, it's a both. But here's the point, it's not everywhere. It's in certain suburbs, it's in certain cities, it's in certain big cities, it's in certain small cities, and it's where those places have the attributes that can engage this clustering.
You began to see, after the rise of the creative class came out, some of the downside of this sorting in America. So what did you do? So
me and a guy named Bill Bishop actually worked together. He wrote this fantastic book called The Big Sort. So we were anticipating...
And explain what that is, because it's about...
The Big Sort, for folks watching, is the idea that in America, this is way before Trump, that we were becoming more divided, not only red and blue, we were sorting into specific kinds of communities that engaged us economically, but reflected our political and cultural biases. And that those divisions, and now we were talking about this in 2002, were expanding over time, and I think neither one of us, certainly I could never have anticipated how big this would go. So what happened was, when you mentioned, I took some great criticism, as you do. When you write a popular book, people read it and they criticize it. I learned from that, but the world changed. The world that I was envisioning of an optimistic, rosy-eyed revitalization coming back to the city in an open-minded environment became very one-sided. Rich people, highly educated people moved back to cities, and parts of cities, not all cities, became like gentrified colonies. And our cities began to split apart. You know, this happened on steroids beginning in 2000, accelerating after 2010. The reason I came to this is I was living in Toronto, where I still spend a good part of my time. And this crazy crack mayor, Rob Ford, got elected. And I was thinking, in Toronto? Toronto the good? Toronto the place that has health care for all? that had invested in transit, at least up to that point, that had safe streets and very little gun crime, why would they elect this populist before Trump? Because the creative class, my creative class, was colonizing the inner city, taking advantage of the great locations close to the university, close to downtown, making money off their housing as it went up. And the working people and the people who worked in those low-end service industries were being pushed out, and our community, just like our country, just like America, was becoming more and more divided. That's what I began to see as the contradiction of the creative class.
And it led to a greater inequality of wealth that became part of the resentment, right?
You know, and we actually documented this in 2002 and 2003 for essays I wrote for, at that time, the Washington Monthly. Mm-hmm. You could see in these creative cores, in San Francisco, in Austin, in Seattle, in Boston, and New York, inequality was the greatest in the nation. But when I came to write about this in the sequel book, The New Urban Crisis, what I found was this contradiction. The more diverse, the more dense, the more innovative, the more open-minded, the more liberal or progressive, more votes for Obama, more votes for Clinton, whatever, the more inequality and more segregation. And that contradiction was what I wanted to focus on.
Why does that happen?
Because of the big sort. Because of this sorting of us by economic status, by class position, by level of education. We're becoming a very sorted country in which the advantaged folks cluster. They can be urban, and there's still many, many advantaged folks in the suburbs of New York, in the suburbs of California, in the suburbs around Boston. We can sort into urban centers and suburbs, but the places we sort into become so darn expensive. You know, look at housing prices in New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles. That less advantaged people, lower skilled people, working people are pushed out.
So tell me about the book then that you wrote that tried to explain that problem.
Well, you know,
was that a walking back of your earlier book?
I don't think it's so much of a walking back as recognizing that things have changed, recognizing some mistakes that I made, and really trying to interpret the world as it evolved. And here's what it was. It kind of tracks the arc of my life. A kid born into the old urban crisis in Newark, in New York City, you know, Ford declaring the city drop dead, you're in bankruptcy, go away, and a crisis of failure, a crisis of complete and total urban failure. Companies moving out, people moving out, they called it in urban studies, hole in the donut. Mm-hmm. Then to see this revitalization come, slowly at first, and then the floodgates open after 2000. But the new urban crisis isn't a crisis of failure. Ironically enough, it's a crisis of urban success. It's a crisis of urban success. The more these cities attracted talent, the more they attracted the creative class, the more they gentrified, the more unequal they became with other parts of the country and within themselves. So, and what I argued in the book is the new urban crisis isn't just a crisis of cities. When you see it play out on the electoral map in the divisions of this country, which you know so much about, it's kind of a crisis of our moment of democratic capitalism. It really is, how do we put these two parts of our economy, the creative centers and the rest of the country, back together? Can we?
So what should we do about gentrification?
Well, I think, you know, look, there's a couple of things that people are, policymakers and academics and thinkers are talking about. First, there is no doubt that we need to build more housing where we need it. Not out in the far-flung exurbs. We need to build more housing in the core and in those old suburbs, you know, which have the single-family homes that can be densified. To do that, we've got to liberalize our land use restrictions, number one. Some people, so-called market urbanists, who I admire a lot, think that's sufficient. I think it's necessary, but insufficient. I think we've got to commit to building affordable housing. In New York now, we have a program in this city where if you're going to build a new tower, I forget the exact fraction, but it's between 20 and 30% of those units you can't buy out. In that new tower, that new luxury tower, have to be devoted to affordable housing. We have to build more transit to connect people out in those suburban areas, and especially those close-in suburbs, and densify around the hubs. And I think the last thing we need to do, which few people are talking about, Walter, about a third of us now in America have the great good fortune to be members of the creative class. We make a pretty good amount of money, even the artists and cultural workers, never mind the scientists and techies. More than half of Americans work in low-wage, crappy, precarious service jobs, condemned to a life almost of disadvantage, almost poverty. When we decided to build a middle class in this country, we made manufacturing work good work. My dad used to tell me he worked in a factory. He started that job in the Depression. When he came back from World War II, FDR, the New Deal, his job became a good family supporting job. He could buy a house in the suburbs, put my brother and I through college. Service workers can't do that today. They are working at, you know, if Karl Marx was back to life, he would say they're working in immiserated subsistence conditions. We need a national effort to upgrade the 50% of low-wage service jobs in food service, preparation, retail work, office work, that are the backbone of our economy, but if people are sinking further and further into poverty.
Do you think in some ways capitalism is broken when it comes to a market economy in cities like that?
Well, in my field, we have a long tradition of Marxist, post-Marxist analysis, and a lot of my critics come from that part. They want to envision, and I learn from these people, particularly a guy named David Harvey, who's absolutely brilliant. But there's a hope for a kind of socialist utopia that doesn't come. So pragmatically, yes, capitalism is broken. What do I believe? I think we have to go about fixing it. How do I think we can best fix it? If we could just empower our cities to begin to address these problems. And why I think it works is because cities aren't gated suburbs. No matter how gentrified New York or San Francisco become, there are still poor people, there are still ethnic and racial minorities, there are still progressive political actors who act on politics. So I do think our cities are going to be the place, they're going to be the laboratories of democracy that figure out the way to create a new social compact that can make this kind of capitalism work. I shudder to think at what the alternative might be.
But if we empower cities, would that leave some people, like the people who live in suburbs or exurbs or in the countryside, leave them out?
I think it might leave people in the reddest parts of the country out. But here's the way I figure it. And I've talked to the leading theorists of this about this, both on the left and the right. Look, we don't agree on many things in this country. We don't agree on gun rights. We don't agree on women's rights. We don't agree on gay rights. I could go down the litany. And already, state preemption is taking a lot of those rights away.
Well, explain what that is.
Well, states, across this country are saying, because they're run by rural and suburban majorities, we're going to prohibit you from acting to control guns. Bill Peduto, the mayor of Pittsburgh, who's a good friend of mine, has several pending civil suits and maybe a criminal case from the Pennsylvania state government that says he's acting too quickly on gun control. Gay rights are another one. So
and minimum wage.
Minimum wage is another one. Although we've seen more red states, interestingly enough, at least be able to raise their minimum wage somewhat. So I think this is happening. What the best theorists of this so-called federalism, the United States is a federalist system where we can adjust the relationship between the federal, the state, and local government, say, yes, Walter, that's a risk in the short run. Yes, Richard, that's a risk in the short run. Over time, though, these states and cities have to compete. So what's happening in Georgia now under the threat of these new women's rights bans and gay rights bans? The Hollywood companies are saying, we're going to have to pull the films that are being made in Atlanta. We're going to have to bring them back to a city that doesn't impose that. So the theorists say this competition for economic growth, well, the same thing I see when I go to Texas. The business people are saying to the governor, stop it. We can't attract an Amazon HQ2 if you keep up this kind of red state looniness in terms of social policy. So the theorists believe that this competition between jurisdictions may lead to some places running to the bottom in the short term, but over time the competition will lead to better outcomes.
When you look at the big sort that you and Bill Bishop have talked about, one of them is these cities that have become enclaves of creative people, and then the areas just around them. You could look at Austin, Texas, going 90% Democrat, and same with Houston. But this right around it go 90% for Trump. Are we dividing our country based on the new urban elite versus the rest of America?
Yes, and these divides are fractal. Big word, fractal. They occur at every scale. They occur between the coastal elite places like the New York, Boston, Washington corridor, and the Southern and Northern California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. But then even within those places, those divides replicate. I mentioned Toronto earlier. Toronto's a very progressive place. It's a very blue place. But even within it, there's red and blue, liberal and conservative. And the way I like to think about it is the knowledge economy or creative economy is very spiky. Tom Friedman had a wonderful book that said the world is flat. For many things, manufacturing, simple services, the world has flattened completely. But within that flat world that Tom explained so brilliantly, there are these spikes. And what happens is these spikes take on a different character, a different economic character, a different political character, and a different cultural character. And the backlash is not so much about the economic inequity. It's about the cultural norms and values. If you live in an urban center, you tend to not want to have guns around you. You want safety. You want to be open-minded to all those people who are contributing to your economy. You want to be pro-immigration and pro-women's rights, because women make up, believe it or not, more than half the creative class is made up of women, just like more than half our economy, population is made up of women. But the creative class is much greater numbers of women than, say, the physical working class. But if you live in one of those places in the outlying areas and you're a white middle-aged man, you feel threatened. You feel threatened by diversity. You feel threatened by women. You feel threatened by the fact that women and immigrants have gotten, in your view, a leg up. You feel threatened by the sexual and gender revolution, and it creates that backlash. So I think that backlash is not just between parts of the country. Yes, it's between parts of the country, but it's within parts of the country as well.
So in other words, between counties and parishes or something, where you have people who are very comfortable with diversity, very comfortable with the creative and knowledge economy, and people who may feel that they're being looked down upon or by the elites.
And so we have a divide in this country, but it's not the old, people get mistaken. It's not the old north-south divide. It's not a frost belt, sun belt. It's not an east-west. It's a new kind of divide that's very spiky, big word, very fractal, very concentrated, but I think we're about evenly split. You know, there's about half of us that are populating one, and that takes the creative class and some of the new immigrant groups, and about half the country that's populating another, and sometimes we live quite close to one. Here's an interesting fact, though. There's a brand new study out that I found so amazing, and it heartened me for a moment, you know, in times that others, viewers may think are dark. This was a group of political scientists who know a ton about the big sort that we've been talking about, and who studied the sorting of Americans, and not just Americans. They looked at the most sorted of us, highly active liberals and highly active conservatives. On national issues, which we've talked about, gun control, social issues, women's rights, abortion, we are worlds apart. When they polled those same people on local issues, do you want your economy to grow? Do you want good schools? And they went down, I'm giving you big, almost complete consensus. And that gave me hope that when we're closer together and focused on our local communities and get out of this chamber, this echo chamber of national issues, when we're focused on hometown, you know, Mike Bloomberg used to famously say you couldn't tell if a mayor's, what was it? There's no liberal or conservative, Republican or Democratic way to pave a street or to deal with
potholes have no party.
Yeah, thank you. Potholes have no party. And I think that really is the case. You know, when I meet mayors and I work with a lot of them, it's very hard for me to tell. And it's very hard for me to tell who's a Republican or a Democrat. So I think that heartens me. When we look at the local issues and get out of the echo chamber of national issues, these high-potency national issues, I think we're a lot better to solve our problems.
And so what policies would you do to try to knit the fabric closer together?
So I don't think we can. I think we're really divided. And I think the divide's gotten worse over my life, you know, and I'm 60-ish years old. I think we're going to have to realize that we are best served by living together as two Americas. And the way to reduce this, I think Trump proves how problematic the imperial presidency. We knew it. People like you and I knew it. But until you had someone who really wasn't up for the job, you couldn't see it. Now you can see how problematic that institution. So what we do is take our Federalist gift, this distribution of powers that we've dialed up, right? Over the past 50 years since the New Deal, we have dialed up the power of the federal government. And we begin to dial it down. No, we don't give all power back to the communities. And I don't mean just the cities. We give power back to the suburbs and rural areas. We give them their tax power back. We give them their economic power back. We enable them to build their own. And we enable them to create the kind of cultural context. You know, look, here's a statistic. About 20% of us live in urban areas. I forget what it is, 60-ish, 70% of us live in suburban areas, and the rest live in rural areas. The overwhelming preponderance of us like where we live. We vote with our feet. In America, we vote. That's what the big sort is. We vote with our feet to be in the kind of places that reflect the cultural and social and political context we want to live in. So let's not avoid that. Let's not spend every 4 or 8 years screaming and yelling at one another. Let's admit that we are 2 or more countries, and let's live together peacefully. Let's create a united, maybe not a United Cities of America, I'm trying, United Communities of America, United Places of America. It won't be perfect. But it'll be a lot more robust and resilient because we're much more successful when we distribute power in any kind of system than when we concentrate it. And I think if we reduce the stakes around these national issues, we'd have a somewhat better chance of being able to get along.
Richard Florida, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Walter.
Appreciate it.
It's great to spend time with you.
Yeah.